Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast.
Yeah.
Today we're taking a deep dive into Marcus Garvey and his audacious creation of a psychological nation that catalyzed the largest mass movement in the history of the African diaspora. And we want to place you, the listener, directly onto the streets of Harlem. It's August of 1920. Imagine Madison Square Garden. Now, a venue that for you and me might bring to mind modern concerts or, basketball.
Right.
But back then, it was typically reserved for the violent theater of boxing or the chaotic pageantry of the circus.
Yeah.
And on this particular day, it has been completely commandeered.
Exactly. The sheer scale of it was, well, it was unprecedented. You had 25,000 delegates who had converged there. We're talking about laborers from the sugar plantations of Cuba, miners from the coal fields of Nova Scotia, and representatives from the colonial capitals of West Africa.
Yeah.
And the visual counterforce they presented was profound. You had the African Legion marching in dark blue attire with sharp red stripes, and they were flanked by the Black Cross nurses in stark white.
Which was a deliberate statement.
Very deliberate. That uniform was a highly calculated and direct rebuke to the Red Cross, an organization that had systematically excluded them.
And right at the absolute center of this geopolitical spectacle stood the architect himself. If you were in that crowd, looking up at Marcus Mosiah Garvey, you'd see a man of relatively modest physical stature. He stood just 5 feet and 4 inches tall.
Right.
But his presence completely dominated the room. He wore a bicorn hat plumed with white feathers, and he possessed this baritone voice with the resonance of a cathedral organ.
He wasn't just giving a speech that day. He was entirely reconfiguring the internal geography of millions of people. I mean, when he announced the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, he wasn't petitioning the League of Nations for permission to exist.
No.
He was asserting to the global powers that a government in exile had already been formed. He was claiming sovereignty without territory.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to forensically examine exactly how a man with absolutely no sovereign soil beneath his feet managed to declare a government in exile, completely rewiring the global consciousness of his era. And to understand the ink, the iron, and the independence of this movement, we really have to start at the genealogical and intellectual roots. We need to take you to the coastal town of St. Ann's Bay on the northern shores of Jamaica. The date is August 17th, 1887. The social hierarchy here was as rigid as the island's limestone topography.
That rigid topography deeply shaped his early life. His father, Marcus Garvey, was a stonemason, and he had a notoriously volatile temperament. But crucially, and this is key, he possessed a vast private library.
Yeah, which was highly unusual.
Profoundly anomalous. For a black tradesman in a British colony in the late 19th century, having a private library was incredibly rare.
And for Garvey, that library functioned as his first passport, didn't it? Because his formal education was abruptly cut short when he was just 14 years old due to severe financial hardship.
It did. Leaving school that early left a permanent psychological imprint on him. It instilled in him a ferocious autodidacticism and a lifelong, unyielding distrust of institutional gatekeepers. Because he couldn't rely on formal institutions, he apprenticed with his godfather, Alfred Burroughs, who ran a printing press right there in St. Ann's Bay.
Right.
This really became his technical crucible. If you can imagine the physical labor of it, he learned to meticulously set type. He felt the heavy, tactile weight of the lead characters in his hands, and he breathed in that sharp, metallic smell of ink day after day.
Which brings us to a massive realization for a young tradesman. You don't just learn how a machine works, you learn what the machine represents.
Precisely. What's fascinating here is the philosophical takeaway. Garvey realized incredibly early that controlling the printing press meant controlling the narrative. Whoever owns the iron and the ink owns the reality that gets distributed to the masses.
But that understanding of labor and power was violently tested in 1908. He had moved to Kingston, working at the P.A. Benjamin Manufacturing Company, where he was highly capable and quickly rose to the position of foreman. But then the Printers Union launched a strike for higher wages. Garvey had a choice to make, and he crossed class lines.
Yeah.
He sided with the workers instead of management.
And he paid a severe price for that solidarity. The strike was mercilessly crushed by the establishment, and Garvey found himself completely blacklisted by the private printing firms of Kingston.
He was essentially exiled from his own trade.
Exactly. This betrayal by the economic establishment radicalized him. It severed any residual faith he had in the possibility of incremental, polite reform within the colonial system.
So cut off from his livelihood, he begins what we can really view as his sociological fieldwork. In 1910, he travels to Costa Rica. If you were to follow him to Limon, you'd find a company town entirely dominated by the United Fruit Company. He works as a timekeeper on the banana plantations, which puts him right at the friction point between management and labor.
From that vantage point, he witnessed Black West Indian workers treated as entirely disposable metabolic units. They were ground down in the extraction of tropical fruit solely for American breakfast tables. He attempted to use his printing background to launch a newspaper there called La Nación to advocate for them.
But colonial indifference completely crushed it.
It did. He then moved to Panama, observing the exact same racial stratification among the canal workers, and launched another paper, La Prensa. Again, it failed.
Which forces a brutal but necessary lesson. The printing press, as powerful as it is entirely insufficient without a robust political organization to defend it and fund it. A newspaper without a movement is just paper.
Exactly. And that realization drives him across the Atlantic. In 1912, Garvey arrives in London for what essentially becomes his intellectual finishing school. By day, he's doing brutal dock work, witnessing firsthand the bottom-up flow of global imperial capital. But by night, he is devouring texts in the reading room of the British Museum and listening to radical speakers at Hyde Park.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, London is where Garvey's philosophical synthesis truly occurs. He isn't just reading in a vacuum. He meets Dusé Muhammad Ali, a Sudanese-Egyptian nationalist who publishes the African Times and Orient Review.
Ali becomes a critical mentor. He introduces Garvey to the broader concepts of Pan-Africanism and the rich, complex histories of pre-colonial African civilizations that the British education system had intentionally erased. Garvey is simultaneously absorbing the intense geopolitical arguments surrounding Egyptian independence and Irish Home Rule. But the true catalyst was a book, Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery.
That text becomes his tactical manual, doesn't it? Because Washington's relentless focus on economic self-reliance perfectly validated the brutal lessons Garvey had learned in the plantations of Central America. Political rights are merely an abstraction, a piece of paper, without the concrete foundation of economic power to enforce them.
That was the synthesis. Armed with this singular, cohesive vision, he returns to Jamaica in 1914 and founds the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. Initially, he attempts to blend Washingtonian economic self-help with a sort of polite British imperial aesthetic.
Yeah.
But the reception in Jamaica is completely tepid. The local middle class is obsessed with shade prejudice and social climbing within the colonial framework. They view Garvey as an uncouth, dark-skinned upstart.
Realizing he's entirely landlocked by this local classism and needs a massive base of capital, he looks north. On March 24, 1916, he arrives in New York City with just a few dollars in his pocket, and he steps into Harlem at the exact moment it's becoming a demographic pressure cooker.
The timing is historic. The Great Migration is in full swing, drawing thousands of African Americans fleeing the feudal terror of the Jim Crow South, right as thousands of Caribbean immigrants are pouring into the same neighborhoods. Garvey steps into this fusion not merely as an immigrant seeking work, but as a political catalyst.
Yet his very first public lecture in May 1916 at St. Mark's Church Hall is a complete, unmitigated disaster. He's incredibly nervous, he literally falls off the stage, and the audience is largely indifferent to his message.
You would think that kind of public humiliation would end a political career before it started.
Here's where it gets really interesting. His resilience bordered on delusion. Instead of quitting and finding a quiet job in a printing shop, he embarks on a grueling tour of 38 states. He methodically studies the rhetorical mastery of black preachers in the Deep South and analyzes the ruthless organizational mechanics of political machines in the Midwest. When he returns to Harlem, he is no longer the nervous immigrant who fell off the stage. He is a transformed master orator.
And he knew that to harness that oratorical power, he needed physical territory. He refused to rent from white landlords or rely on the benevolence of established churches. So in 1919, the UNIA acquired Liberty Hall at 120 West 138th Street.
If you were to walk into Liberty Hall in the summer of 1919, you wouldn't just be stepping into a neighborhood meeting space. You'd feel the intense heat trapped by the low tin ceiling, you'd sit on these rough wooden benches, and you'd be hit by the deafening sound of thousands of voices. You have to realize, for the people in that room, this was the parliament of a stateless nation. The walls were draped with the movement's catechism: one God, one aim, one destiny.
Garvey would stand in that heat and speak for hours. His cadence bypassed purely intellectual arguments and struck directly at the emotional core. He told his audience, many of whom were just one generation removed from slavery, that they were not the descendants of property, but the children of kings and queens. He convinced them that their poverty was a man-made condition, a machine that they had the power to unmake themselves.
But Liberty Hall only held a few thousand people. To project that message globally, he returned to his roots and launched the Negro World newspaper in August 1918.
We really need to look at the technical forensics of this publication. It was an absolute juggernaut. It reached a peak circulation of 500,000 copies a week, systematically printed in English, Spanish, and French to cross colonial borders. It featured Garvey's signed editorial on the front page, but what actually made it the most dangerous publication in the colonial world was its clandestine distribution network.
It's amazing how he weaponized the infrastructure of the very empires he opposed to distribute the paper. The Negro World was strictly banned in Dahomey, Trinidad, British Guiana, and the Gold Coast. If the colonial police caught you with a copy, it meant immediate imprisonment.
But as history shows, prohibition only drives up the value of the contraband. Black seamen working in the boiler rooms of merchant vessels became the hidden arteries of this network. They smuggled tight bundles of the Negro World deep in the engine rooms and coal bunkers, covertly handing them off to local dock workers in foreign ports.
That's incredible.
A single smuggled, crumpled copy might be read aloud by lamplight to 100 illiterate villagers in the interior. Garvey's voice was technically amplified 1,000-fold.
So what does this all mean for the actual economics of the movement? Propaganda and psychological shifts are vital, but they don't sustain a stateless nation on their own. He needed an economic engine. Garvey was fundamentally a capitalist, and his stated strategy was to fight white capitalism with black capitalism. So he established the Negro Factories Corporation.
The corporation was essentially a massive holding company designed to build a self-sufficient, closed-loop ecosystem right there in Harlem. We are talking about acquiring grocery stores, a restaurant, a steam laundry, and a publishing house. These weren't just standard small businesses. They were explicit proof-of-concept demonstration projects to prove to the world and to themselves that Black people could manage highly complex enterprises entirely free of white supervision or capital.
But the absolute centerpiece of this economic program, and ultimately the engine of his ruin, was the Black Star Line. Incorporated in Delaware in June 1919, it was the physical, iron manifestation of the Back to Africa dream, and the financing structure was a masterstroke of populism.
It was. Shares were deliberately priced at just $5. This meant that a domestic worker in New York, a sharecropper in Mississippi, or a canal worker in Panama could actually own a piece of this sovereign dream. Millions of dollars poured into the UNIA's coffers from the working class.
Okay, let's unpack this. He has the grand vision, he has the populism, and he has millions of dollars pouring in from everyday people. But how did this actually look on a ledger? Did he have the maritime expertise to pull this off, or was it a logistical nightmare?
It was a complete logistical nightmare. A forensic financial analysis reveals a catastrophe of technical incompetence. Garvey knew absolutely nothing about the maritime industry and routinely surrounded himself with opportunists and charlatans. Let's look at their first ship, the SS Yarmouth, which they rechristened the Frederick Douglass. It was an 1887 coal and cattle freighter bought for an astronomically inflated $165,000.
Wow.
It was essentially a rotting hulk. On its maiden voyage, attempting to run whiskey to Cuba during early Prohibition, the crew partially stole the cargo, and the ship nearly sank in New York Harbor before it even hit the open sea.
And the acquisition somehow only grew more absurd from there.
They did. Next was the SS Shadyside, an 1873 Hudson River paddle wheeler. It was built exclusively for calm river water and was utterly unfit for the stress of the ocean. They bought it for $35,000 to run Harlem summer cruises, but it was soon abandoned in Fort Lee, New Jersey, where it literally sank into the mud.
Just left there to rot.
Exactly. Then came the SS Kanawha, a steam yacht previously owned by the financier Henry Huddleston Rogers. It was a luxury pleasure craft, not a commercial vessel. They paid $60,000 to purchase it and immediately needed another $25,000 just in basic repairs. On its first Caribbean voyage, a boiler exploded, tragically killing a crew member. It was eventually abandoned to rust in Cuba.
The technical failure is completely undeniable.
Yeah.
The ships were constantly breaking down, the underpaid crews were mutinous, and the astronomical insurance premiums were bleeding the organization dry. Yet there is a profound philosophical stake here that we can't ignore. If you were a UNIA member standing on the docks in New York or Philadelphia in 1920, the mere existence of those smokestacks bearing the Black Star emblem provided an immeasurable nuclear level of psychological pride.
Absolutely.
You were looking at a future where you were the captain of your own destiny, regardless of the rust on the hull.
And that very pride, that visible assertion of independence, made Garvey a massive target for the state. The collapse of his empire wasn't solely a product of his own maritime ignorance. It was actively and systematically engineered by the United States government. J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the ambitious young head of the General Intelligence Division, became obsessed with Garvey.
Hoover viewed him not just as a nuisance, but as a grave national security threat, labeling him a notorious Negro agitator. And despite Garvey explicitly and publicly rejecting communism, Hoover launched a relentless covert war against the UNIA in 1919.
This represents a highly historic intelligence operation. Hoover actually hired the Bureau's first black agents specifically to infiltrate and destroy the UNIA from the inside. You have Agent 800, a man named James Wormley Jones, who was a former police officer and Army captain. He successfully infiltrated the Harlem headquarters and gained direct access to their chaotic financial books.
But the most devastating betrayal didn't come from a stranger. It came from Agent P-138, Herbert S. Bullen. Bullen wasn't just an agent. He was a Jamaican businessman who owned a black doll company in Harlem. But more importantly, he was one of Garvey's most trusted confidants.
Yeah, that betrayal cuts deep.
If you can imagine the betrayal, he shared intimate dinners with Garvey, he knew his deepest private anxieties, and he was secretly feeding all of this psychological intelligence back to Hoover, detailing Garvey's desperate, flailing attempts to keep the bleeding Black Star Line afloat.
Hoover's strategy was methodical. Find any federal crime to pin on Garvey to neutralize the movement. Tax evasion proved too difficult because the UNIA's books were a total mess, so they pivoted to mail fraud under 18 U.S.C. 338. The government's argument was that Garvey knew the Black Star Line was totally insolvent and the ships were unseaworthy, yet he continued selling stock through the U.S. mail, falsely promising a profitable enterprise.
The trial commences in May 1923 before Judge Julian Mack, and here is where Garvey's own hubris becomes completely fatal. Believing his oratorical genius, the same genius that captivated Liberty Hall, could sway any room, Garvey fired his attorney to represent himself.
It was a disastrous miscalculation. A federal courtroom is not Liberty Hall. It is a highly disciplined, rigid theater of procedure. Garvey's cross-examinations were rambling and deeply unorthodox. He quickly alienated the judge and the all-white jury. Meanwhile, the prosecutor, Maxwell Maddock, was a highly disciplined legal technician, methodically building a fraud case brick by brick.
And yet the entire federal case ultimately hinged on remarkably tenuous evidence. An empty envelope.
Right.
The prosecution called Benny Dancy, a cleaner at Penn Station. Dancy testified that he'd bought stock and received mail from the company, but he couldn't remember what was actually in the envelope, or even if he had ever read it. He just identified the envelope itself.
The prosecution argued it must have contained fraudulent promotional material. On the weight of that empty envelope, Garvey was convicted by the all-white jury. Tellingly, his three co-defendants, the men who actually managed the daily financial details, were all acquitted. This raises an important question regarding the nature of justice in this era, confirming for many observers the suspicion that this was a political assassination cloaked as a standard fraud conviction. In February 1925, Garvey was sentenced to 5 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Yet his defiance remained entirely intact. From his prison cell, he wrote an editorial for the Negro World, famously stating, "Look for me in the whirlwind or the storm. Look for me all around you."
President Calvin Coolidge eventually commuted his sentence in November 1927, following a massive international petition campaign. But the commutation came with a harsh stipulation: his immediate deportation.
Okay.
They didn't even let him say goodbye to his followers.
No.
Garvey was placed in a sealed train car from Atlanta to New Orleans, explicitly denied the chance to speak to the thousands of supporters waiting for him at the train stations along the route. As his ship pulled away from the dock in New Orleans, you can imagine him standing on the deck, watching the mechanical empire he had built fade into the mist.
It was an exile from which his structural organization would never recover. He eventually relocated to London in 1935, returning to the imperial capital where his ideas had first coalesced decades earlier. But his final years were severely diminished. He lived in West Kensington, spending his days quietly feeding pigeons in the park.
The end came in May 1940. He suffered a debilitating stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed. While recovering in his bed, he happened to read his own premature obituary published in the Chicago Defender. The piece brutally and unfairly dismissed him as broke, alone, and unpopular. The shock and heartbreak of reading that dismissal triggered a second fatal stroke. He died at age 52, an ocean away from the African continent he had fought so relentlessly to reclaim.
But the vault of his legacy could not be sealed. The mechanical empire of steam and steel failed, but the ideological seed he planted germinated globally, creating an indestructible psychological infrastructure. If we trace the forensic accounting of his ideas, in Kingston, a street preacher named Leonard Howell used Garvey's teachings to prophesy the crowning of a black king in Africa. This laid the exact theological foundation for the Rastafari movement, framing Marcus Garvey as the John the Baptist to Haile Selassie.
And if you look at the United States, the parents of Malcolm Little were fervent, dedicated Garveyites. Malcolm X was raised directly on the UNIA doctrine of radical self-sufficiency, which heavily shaped the ideology of the Nation of Islam. Across the Atlantic, the red, black, and green flag, designed by the UNIA in 1920, became the definitive standard for African liberation movements. Kwame Nkrumah explicitly cited Garvey as his primary inspiration in the fight for Ghana's independence.
The physical ships sank into the mud, but the psychological vessels absolutely reached their destination. In 1964, his remains were finally exhumed from London and returned to an independent Jamaica, where he was enshrined as the nation's first national hero in National Heroes Park. The forensic accounting of Marcus Garvey's life reveals a monumental paradox. Here is a businessman who failed spectacularly at business, yet he successfully bankrupted the psychological hegemony of white supremacy. He built phantom ships that never physically reached Africa, but he transported millions of minds to a continent they had never seen. The Black Star Line was a graveyard of rusted metal and lost savings. But as a symbol, it proved to the descendants of the enslaved that a horizon beyond the plantation was entirely possible.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over. The biographer Abel Arroyo leaves us with a haunting interrogative regarding this massive, complex legacy. Was the massive financial failure of this mechanical empire the necessary price for the success of the spiritual one? Did the rusting, ruined hulls of the Yarmouth and the Kanawha serve as the required sacrificial burnt offerings to permanently ignite the consciousness of a race?
It's something to think about.
Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.